I've been getting a lot of questions about how my Octatrack is set up. This video is an overview of how all my instruments are connected. Let's start with the OP1. My OP1 is routed into my Empress Reverb, which goes into inputs C and D. I like to do this because the OP1 is extremely dry, and I don't like to use an extra effect on the OP1 internally just to add reverb. So I use this for more versatility when it comes to having reverb, which I then sample into the machine. We're not going to go too far into the details of how I put it in the Octatrack, but suffice it to say that I use a through machine typically for my inputs. There's also the option of directly routing your signal through the mix page, but I like to have more control over whether I hear the OP1 or not, and I like to have an extra set of 2 effects. So I typically put my OP1 in track 7. Next up we have the bass station and the Minotaur. Now these are tools that I don't use quite as frequently as the OP1, but it's something that I want to experiment with next week. So at the moment I have them set to inputs A and B, and that allows me to switch between the 2 of them as a bass source, which I'm also planning on setting up in track 8 or elsewhere as an input. When you have a mono input like this, you can't direct send the signal out of the Electron Octatrack without having it pan left or right. So the only way to get a mono signal sent straight down the middle is to set up a through machine and to choose the input A or B. When it comes to MIDI, I have a MIDI controller, the FaderFox PC4, which is sending a MIDI out signal into the MIDI in of the Octatrack. This allows me to control a variety of different things, which I can elaborate on in the next section. I'll also link in the description the PDF of the Octatrack manual, because there's a page where you can see exactly what the MIDI CC values are. And if you navigate to your MIDI preferences, you'll see that in the channel section, each of the channels has its own MIDI channel mapped to the corresponding number. So track 1 is mapped to channel 1, track 2 is mapped to channel 2. And in that case, you basically map the same MIDI signals, but you just adjust which channel that it's sending it to. I also have the option of sending MIDI out. I'm not going to do any daisy chaining or anything like that with MIDI this time around, but basically I'm choosing the FaderFox to send MIDI in, and as for sending MIDI out, I can send either to the Minotaur or the bass station. These are 2 instruments that I have on here that have MIDI cable capabilities. And so, especially in the case of the Minotaur, this is essential because there's no keyboard. So in that case, you could also find in the corresponding manual MIDI CC commands that you can then map in the MIDI section right here. For those of you that are curious about the FaderFox, I can still give a little bit more background on it. It's made by FaderFox. It's called the PC4, and it's USB powered, which means you can either plug it into a computer or use one of those charging blocks that you get with phones and pretty much anything else these days. It takes an 1/8 inch in and MIDI in and out, and it comes with a single converter, which is why I don't have MIDI in. I don't think MIDI in is necessary, except if you're trying to switch the inputs, the input functionality between jumping and snapping, which is actually quite a valuable tool. But in my case, I haven't quite made that jump yet, and I haven't even been able to experiment because I don't have a functioning 1/8 inch to 5-pin cable. So for the moment, I don't actually know how well that works. But the FaderFox is a pretty versatile unit. You can save up to 16 pages of different MIDI commands. The only issue is that when you have it mapped to jump, you know, if you change pages, suddenly your knob changes are going to cause these really big CC jumps. So it remains to be seen if the snap functionality eliminates that issue. I'm going to create a more in-depth video about the FaderFox just because I've seen that there really isn't any video documentation about it. But I'd rather save that for a more specific video, so stay tuned for that. Now as for the audio signal, the Octatrack sends the main out to my analog heat over here, which then goes into my mixer. My mixer is currently set up to send the analog heat signal to channel 1, and my cue is set to channel 2. I have this set up this way because I'm testing out using the second channel as a resample, and I haven't really figured out where I'm going to put that since my track 8 is now going to be an additional through machine, but we'll play with that a little bit. Basically, the hope is that I can resample to a single track. I can mute that track, say if it's track 8, like that. If this track 8 is muted, we cue it. Now it's going exclusively to the cue out. And so if I have track 8 set up as a resample, I can record a sample of what's going on in the master, and it'll just be looping in the background until I decide to bring it in. And that gives me an opportunity to switch entirely to this channel on the right, and then change up what's going on in the Octatrack. Once I'm ready, I can bring it back in. All right, what we're looking at now is the back of my Mk2 audio interface. I have a lot of inputs and outputs available to me, and this gives me a lot of versatility. So this is kind of the secret weapon when it comes to recording my Octatrack. For those of you who have an Octatrack, you've probably lamented the complications and complexity that you have to deal with if you actually want separate stems exported out. In my case, I have a hard time sacrificing stereo signal. That's just something that I'm so used to that I would rather not deal with panning everything left and right. Although I do know that that gives you the possibility of having up to 4 mono channels. But for me, I tend to just separate things out into cue and master. In the case of the mixtape tracks that I've been working on in the past few weeks, I have my cue out sent directly into one of these pair, and my master is sent into the mixer, which is then sent out into this. This is so that if I want to change up the mix, I have a lot of control over what goes on in that case. If you guys have been watching during my stream, you know that I use the cue out primarily for vocals. And this is just because vocals are typically the thing that you need to shape or structure the most after the fact. So I try not to shape too much of it early on, and I just leave that to when I have things in Ableton. Recently, as I've been recording the tracks that I worked on over the past few weeks, I decided I wanted to add a third pair of inputs to the equation. And this third pair actually goes straight from the Empress Reverb, which I talked about earlier. Basically, instead of sending the OP1 to my track 7 through channel, I'm sending it directly to Ableton. So that gives me a total of 3 stereo inputs. I have the Octatrack, I have the vocal, and I have my OP1. This means that all I have to do is monitor through the Mk2 directly, and I'll have a similar experience to the one I have when I have everything plugged into the mixer directly. And I'm able to balance it in Ableton as I'm recording as well. It also means that my performance when it comes to recording like a final version doesn't have to be exactly perfect, because I can still adjust slight timings when it comes to my OP1 performance, or I can sub in a particular Octatrack performance for another. And that's one of the sort of quality of life decisions I made. Even though I want some of the spontaneity preserved during my Octatrack performances, I still want a little bit more control when it comes to recording it down. One last thing that I'll mention is I have a pair of outs which are programmed through Mk2's interface software on the computer to basically create an external out that I can customize within Ableton. And sometimes I'll send that into my stereo AB inputs of my Octatrack, which lets me use pretty much anything on my computer as a potential input. So I could be sending out something I saw on YouTube, I could be sending out my bass, as some of you may have seen in one of my streams. It basically gives me a lot of opportunity to resample things into my Octatrack, and I find that a very helpful way to blend sort of the studio setup with something that's a bit more spontaneous. And that's pretty much all there is to it. If you have any other comments or questions, just direct them to the comment section below, and I will reply to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.